we are moving on to the next one, which actually we're going to the strategy of EFSA and member states to collect data. We are going to have, I believe, a joint presentation by Dr. Leif Busk. Dr. Busk obtained his basic training as a toxicologist at Uppsala University and the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. He has 40 years of experience in regulatory toxicology, both from the pharmaceutical and food sector, and has been the Swedish representative in the advisory forum of EFSA since the very beginning. He's presently working as a scientific advisor at the Swedish National Food Agency. And Mr. Stefano Cappe. Stefano is from EFSA. He's currently the responsible of the team Evidence and Data Management in the Evidence Management Data Unit of EFSA. The team managed the data collection, we all know Stefano, on chemical contaminants, additive pesticide residues, veterinary drug residues, zoonosis, antimicrobial resistance, and molecular typing. Project manager of the EFSA Scientific Data Warehouse, also the tool that enabled the access on the web of the collected data. He's been employed since 2007 in EFSA and contributed to the creation of harmonized standard for the data that we all know very well, the standard sample description, and the data transfer guidance on data exchange. Okay.
So first of all, thanks from me and Stefano for coming here, being allowed to speak to you about data collection by public bodies. And I think this morning has been very interesting. We've had lectures that are really visionary. And what I myself and Stefano, we will talk about the situation we have today. What have we done? Where are we when it comes to data collection? And you can see that as a kind of basis to move on into open EFSA, as has been declared by the executive director of EFSA that EFSA should move. So, data collection. We will go through actually the sequence of data collection, data validation, and scientific data warehouse, which is data management. In reality. The data collection deals about data transmission, for example, we talk about that, the data validation about the quality of the data, and the scientific data warehouse, where you can really extract data and make analysis. Now, the core business of EFSA is to produce opinions, among other things. That's risk characterizations. And for that, you need exposure assessment data, you need hazard characterization assessments. And to do that, you need basic data. For the hazard characterization, you need animal data, biological data, human data, to identify and characterize the hazards. And to do an exposure assessment, you need data on occurrence. Could be chemicals, could be microbes, could be nutrients. And you need knowledge of consumption data. But you need also tools to use this to make these calculations. And in the interface between consumption data and occurrence data, you need, for example, systems to describe and categorize food. And we'll come back to that later on. Yes, please. Now, who are involved in these activities? Is the unit of Stefano, the evidence management unit at EFSA, is the advisory forum, who tries to promote the collection of data. The focal points do a lot of work, especially when it comes to requests between member states for data. And we have the scientific networks who do the actual work. For example, BSE, zoonosis, microbes, chemicals, pesticides, food consumption data. Now, we know that EFSA don't have laboratories. So the laboratories of EFSA are the laboratories of the member states. And that is why it's so important with cooperation. This is regulated in the food law also. So we have the Food Law 178/2002. It says about data collection that the member states shall take the necessary measures to enable the data they collect in the field of EFSA be transmitted to the authority. So there are some mandatory demands for data providing. It's also in the regulation on harmonization that EFSA should forward to member states and the Commission appropriate recommendations which might improve the technical comparability of data. A little bit weakly written perhaps, but it has to do with data harmonization. That is, as you see in a moment, very important.
Okay. I can use this one. I can use this one. Okay. Basically, EFSA is working as a facilitator for the data collection, because we have seen that data are basically produced and transmitted to EFSA by member states. But there is an essential part of work which we have to do in catalyzing the effort of providing this data to EFSA so that the collection of this data is efficient and effective for the purpose that EFSA has for this data. Now, as Leif already said, standardization and harmonization initiatives are essential for the provision of this data to EFSA. The first component, one of the components, for example, is the establishment of a standard for describing an analysis performed by a laboratory in a member state. And we call this data set standard sample description. And this is a method of describing a data set which contains information on the sample analyzed, the analytical parameter, and also the values that are used, the analytical methods, in a very detailed manner. And it's used currently for pesticide residues and chemical contaminants. So you can see already that this method allows us to bridge a little bit sometimes silos that exist between different data domain, we call them, like, for example, pesticide data, chemical data, and eventually also microbiological data. So the data harmonization is really there to bridge the data domain aspects which are sometimes covered in different parts of legislation, for example. And another important component of the harmonization, and I would say probably the most fundamental, are the standard terminology that we saw in a previous talk called with a different name of information identities. And here we have, for example, list of parameters that are used in the analysis, which can be substances or, for example, microbiological agents, and also, for example, food. Food is very important because, as Leif said in the previous presentation, the food is the element that bridge the, for example, the chemical data and the consumption data to produce the exposure assessment. And you need to have very well standardized information on food in order to be able to combine these two different aspects to perform the exposure assessment. Then the other aspect that EFSA is doing, in addition to elaborate together with member states the harmonization of the data, is to provide tools for collecting and validating the data. For example, the data collection framework, which is used by member states to submit their data and to receive an automatic feedback on the data that they have submitted, because data quality is very important, and we try to formalize in business rule, we call, or validation rules, a series of checks that we request to the data transmitters on their data, so that the data that we receive is sufficiently of good quality. Another aspect are, for example, the standard terminology. And here I wanted to present one of the most complex, because standard terminologies evolved in the last year in more and more complex systems. They started with a simple list to define, for example, list of parameters, list of food, but then we realized that in order to aggregate millions of data, we had to create hierarchies, we had to create thesauri, and also, more recently, we had to add information, like, for example, we have to interlink this information, creating then ontologies. And Foodex is already an example of an ontology to describe food, which is used in our data collection. Another important aspect that we cannot forget is that the harmonization is not just with the interface that EFSA has of the national competent authority in the member state, but it is mainly with the entire infrastructure of data collection in the member state, because very often the data are not generated inside the national competent authority, but the national competent authority is as well an hub at national level of other, maybe local authorities, and then of laboratories. So there is an entire chain of supplier of the information before these data arrive to EFSA. And we have always to remember that when we do, for example, changes to our lists, to our standard, we have an impact on the entire data production chain. So now I leave the word to Leif.
Yeah, data validation, and Stefano has already touched upon that. Data quality is very important, of course, and this goes, as it is now, in a joint iterative process where the member states submit data to EFSA, and EFSA does the quality check according to the rules that we have today, and gives feedback to the member states, who make amendments and changes as necessary, send the data back to EFSA, and there's a data validation feedback. So this is a continuous process. And the reason is of course, that quality is a paramount thing. And it's the same here, as Stefano said, when it comes to collection, that much of these things happen within the member states. And in my view, I think the national competent authorities are quite well educated now about how to use these systems that Stefan has described. But we have some way to go, at least in some member states, to get this knowledge down to the single laboratories. And of course, no chain is more well, no chain is better than the weakest part, so to say. So it is important that we finalize this national work. And it goes without saying that if you want to increase the use, exploiting the data, the demand for high quality data will increase. And it will also be a higher efficiency in all the steps of data collection chain. And it goes also without saying that data quality is a win-win deal for both the data provider and the receivers.
Okay, last step. When we have done all our work, and it's a lot of work which involve, in particular, member state in providing this data, then we can talk about data analysis and access to data, which is basically the thing that everybody is more interested, but we should never forget all the preparatory work that is done before we reach to the data analysis part. And EFSA is also organizing to be the data storage of the data that is collected, and set up the data warehouse rightly to store all the data that we collect, and then to provide, through tools connected to the data warehouse, capabilities not only of extracting data from that, but also to perform analysis on the data as such. Currently, we cover 4 different data domains, which is consumption, chemicals, zoonosis, and chemical hazard. And then we can see that, for example, every domain can store data of different nature. Like, for example, in the chemicals domain, we have chemical contaminants and pesticide residues, additive occurrence, and so on. So basically, every data domain includes already data of different nature. And basically, these are information that is currently stored in the data warehouse so far. And, okay, one second. And I didn't want to include here the example of data extraction because we have a nice booth in the entrance of the poster area. So if you are interested to see a little bit of maps and data visualization of the data, I invite you to come to the poster session and to ask to me and my colleague to visualize a bit the data that we can that we have stored in the data warehouse. Another important aspect when you have collected the data and you want to provide access to the data is to have a data warehouse access rule, so that all the parties that are providing the data and that are accessing the data are aligned on what kind of access we can do of the different data. For example, currently we have identified 4 main actors, which is EFSA and European Commission, working group and panel members, data providers and reporting officer, and other, which is basically general public and other international organization. You can see that, for example, EFSA and European Commission have access to all raw data and also the aggregated statistics that are already computed in the data warehouse. Then we have working group and panel member that will have access. I have to say will because we are still working on this second point. Subset needed for EFSA opinions for the duration of the working group panel to raw data, and data via the aggregated dashboards and exports to the entire, to all the aggregation available in the data warehouse. Then we have data providers and reporting officer, which can access to raw data that they have provided, which is sometimes, it can be assumed not to be very interesting because they already know the data that they provided, but sometimes they don't have the tools to analyze, for example, the data, in particular when the scale of the data provided start to be huge. So in this way, for example, they are provided with basic analysis functionalities on their data sets. Then we have also a new thing that started already this year on raw data access from other organizations based on bilateral or multilateral agreements. So now that we have collected all this data in one single place, organizations in the member state can cooperate and find agreements on how to share this data. And we started with a Circle of Trust initiative where 15 countries have decided to share their data at row level basis. So it's a way to breach a little bit the distrust element and to have already a step forward an open access approach to the data as such. And then we have the general public and other organizations that can get so far access with aggregated dashboards and exports. This part is described in the data warehouse access rule document, which is published on the EFSA website if you are interested to the nitty-gritty details of the access rules. Basically, we have seen that we have a lot of cooperation with member states in the area of data collection and data validation. The data warehouse is opening an entire new series of capacity of exploiting the data for collaboration with member states in the sense of share, for example, exposure assessment activities. Okay, for example, for increased workload, we need to share, for example, the production of some outputs, and there also to be able to better use competences which can be available in the member states. And it also opened the possibility in the future to go beyond the national competent authority and to allow academia and industries eventually to exploit this kind of information. I leave the conclusion to Leif.
Yes. When Anna looks at me like she did a moment ago, it means that your time is almost out. So this is the final slide. In conclusion, I would like to say that based on the founding regulation, we have constructed platforms, methods to exchange data in quite a good way. But there is still more work to be done, of course. And someone talked this morning about the governance of data. And if we go to an open EFSA, sharing more data, there will be more players coming in. For the moment, it is EFSA who is running the show, supported by the member states. I foresee in the very near future that member states will take a more active part in the governance. And if we want to induce, for example, industry or other stakeholders, the question of how the data are governed will be even more interesting to discuss, and there is a need to discuss it. Being in Italy, we have a little car there. It's a Ferrari or a Maserati or something like that. And I think we've built a reasonably good car over the years now. But the question is, of course, how should we increase the efficient use of this refined machinery? And I think that has much to do with the data governance. So with that, we conclude our talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both for this comprehensive talk about EFSA and member state strategies. I think we have time still for maybe one or two questions. Oh.
Thank you for this presentation. As you rely on the activity of external laboratories, I was wondering how your work is fitting into the international collaborations which are aiming at standardizing data.
Yes. EFSA has established EFSA has invested a lot of effort in the past year to clean out basically and to be prepared in having data of good quality. I think that now we are facing to the next step challenge, and it's also reflected in our strategic objective to become a little bit more open and more involved, for example, with the use of existing standard. And for example, when we go to open data or linked open data, for sure EFSA will do an effort. Well, we'll do an effort. We will use for sure standard which are the standard of the open data platform. So this is going to be done, and it's part of the scope of the next few years.
Perhaps we should also add that there's a flow of data that goes from the laboratories to the municipal or regional offices and then to the competent national authority who sort of packs it finally and sends it to EFSA. So it is a quality assurance in that line also.
Okay. There is another question here.
I am Eleni Kakuri from State General Laboratory. Just to add something to this flow of data from laboratories to food safety authorities of each member state, and then transmission of this data to EFSA. A basic thing for the laboratories is to have a laboratory information system which has to be adapted to EFSA requirements with the standard sample description and food 1 and 2 description and coding of food. So in this way, will easily be transmitted to EFSA and data warehouse. And a small second question is how quickly will be this open access to the other stakeholders, to academia, to industry? And do you see that this will be done in the near future or in a more long term? I see. Just this is my question. Thank you.
Well, I think as Ima said before, these things are going in steps. And I didn't say that, for example, I mean, even the access rights which are described in the data warehouse access policy, nonetheless, they may seem a little bit conservative. They took at least 3 years to be discussed and approved. So we have to be prepared to have a long path in front of us. But we have to, in a sense, we have to put the precondition to be able to follow this path. And for sure, the two preconditions is to have the technological infrastructure available, the data available, and also the governance able to guide the process. So when we have this infrastructure, for sure the challenge of open data maybe will take some years, but at the end will be wind, I think.
Thank you very much. I think we'll leave, well, one more question maybe on the end.
Yes, a question on your philosophy in relation to the rapid evolution of next generation sequencing data, which in my mind really can shift what now is considered the typical public health activities to clinical laboratories. So how do you prepare for that?
Well, do you want to answer? Okay.
Now, EFSA have launched a call for thematic grants, and there's no secret that the first 2 grants will go to work you're describing here. So EFSA is in the process of building up competence and infrastructures for handling whole genome sequencing. So that's an answer to your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much to both of you.